Welcome to Breaking the Spell. I'm your host, Douglas, and for today, I have a really special guest that's agreed to come on the show to talk about a very fascinating, intriguing topic, which is about human extinction. It's something that dovetails with my interest in philosophical pessimism, philosophical misanthropy, climate change. So, I'm really glad to have Émile Torres, who is a philosopher and historian, to talk about human extinction and the threats to civilization and humanity. So, Émile, thanks for coming onto the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to talk a little bit, introduce you a little bit to our viewers. So Émile, as I mentioned, is a philosopher and historian, and they have published on a wide range of topics in all sorts of places, such as the Washington Post, New Statesman, Aeon, Philosophy Now, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And, the topics include machine superintelligence, emerging technology, religious eschatology, as well as history and ethics of human extinction. Émile has just published their latest book, Human Extinction, A History of the Science and Ethics of Annihilation. So congrats, Émile, for this wonderful achievement. Now, Émile's previous books include Morality, Foresight, and Human Flourishing, an Introduction to Existential Risks, which included a foreword from the UK Astronomer Royal, Lord Martin Rees, and The End, What Science and Religion Tells Us About the Apocalypse. Now, in addition, Émile writes that they used to be a transhumanist and long-termist, and we will define these terms later in our conversation, but now has become a very vocal critic of what they call the TESCREAL bundle of ideologies, which they consider to be both philosophically flawed and potentially dangerous. Again, it's something that we will define and deconstruct in our conversation. And as a last note, Émile actually wrote in his bio that he's passionate about elevating global poverty. They have pledged to give away everything he earned. They earn over 35,000 a year, and they have also started a fundraiser with Nathan Young and Effective Altruists. So this is really a wonderful human being that I'm talking to right now. Okay,
thank you. That's very kind of you.
Yeah. No, I think it's always good to let our viewers know what kind of human being that we have on our show, and I just want to give that kind of details. So, Émile, I just want to first say, I first came across your work on Twitter. Okay, now we have to call it X. But the reason is because I subscribe to quite a number of philosophy and political spaces, and I really, really love your article in Truth Dick, The Bright Side of Extinction. I shared it on my Facebook, and you made many arguments and points, which I mentioned dovetail with many of my philosophical interests as well. Although I haven't been able to get a copy of your new book, right? We are going to talk about it, and just to let our viewers know, Émile has been gracious enough to provide a 20,000 word summary of his 200,000 word thesis on their website, which I will provide in the description box. For the sake of our audience, we will assume they don't know about you and your work, and why do we even want to talk about human extinction. So I really like to get into what motivates you, to discuss this topic, and should we even discuss this topic? Is there even real prospect, whether in our lifetimes or later? And I just wanted to say also that reading your 20,000 word summary was a really intellectually stimulating and challenging task for me. There was so much information, arguments, terms, and I'm really afraid that conversation will do justice, but I'm glad to have it anyway. And lastly, I just want to add that if besides the book itself, Émile has also written a lot of articles in different magazines, which will make for a very fertile ground for a discussion later. So some of the titles of their articles include such as Will God-like AI kill us all or unlock the secrets of the universe? Probably not. Dangerous Visions, how the quest for utopia could lead to catastrophe. The doomsday clock is an imperfect metaphor, but the existential danger is all too real. How Elon Musk sees the future, his bizarre sci-fi vision should concern us all. So these are just really wonderful, topics to talk about. And for our viewers, right, I feel like if they don't quite get where you're coming from, one of the best places they should look at actually is in the bookstores. There are books right now written such as What We Owe the Future by William MacAskill, The Precipice, Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity by Toby Ott. And if, as a viewer, you're wondering, what kind of world does Silicon Valley and technocratic billionaires like Elon Musk want to bring us to? If that is your concern, you want to hear Émile's critical and indispensable counter-arguments. They're all very spell-breaking and very concerning, topics for all of us. So without further ado, I can actually start with asking Émile our default question. So Émile, the first question we ask our guests is, when was the first time you realized something was not right with the world?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I actually just recently wrote, it hasn't been published yet, a long article about how I ended up being, against my will, a philosophical pessimist. And one of the stories that I mentioned in the article is that I have a vivid memory of when I was, I think, around 10, and somebody explained to me that every single year, millions of people starve to death. And it was right around then that I also was told about a child who I think was like maybe living, in the same general town that I grew up in, who was diagnosed with brain cancer and died. And that was sort of terrifying for the obvious reason that maybe it could happen to me too. But I have enough empathy to think, even if I'm completely safe, that's just a horrible, horrible thing for someone to ever, for parents, for the child, and so on. So that was, I think, those were epiphanic moments that sort of defined, that changed my understanding of the world. And so basically, I would say that in response to this news, I sort of formulated what I would now call the Schopenhauerian hypothesis. Just this notion that the world is in general very bad. Maybe it would be better if Earth had remained as lifeless as the moon, to paraphrase Schopenhauer. And then I really one way of looking at my entire life over the next 3 decades, like a lot of my academic pursuits, and so on, is just one giant effort to disprove this hypothesis, because I do not want it to be true. I do not want to live in a world that's terrible. And I don't know, just over the past decade, really the past 5 years, I have increasingly come to sort of acknowledge that my efforts have failed. And, I think the hypothesis is correct. I certainly, would want to emphasize that there are, lots and lots of wonderful, amazing things about life, about, the, lovely aspects of the human condition. But in general, like it's pretty bleak. And yeah, so I mean, the other thing I would just want to add, if I may, is this, I feel like it's useful to distinguish between a sort of a strong version of pessimism and then a weaker, more contingent version. And the strong version would say that, existence under any circumstances is bad. So maybe like David Benatar accepts this, like, birth is always a net harm. Even if in your life, the most you suffer is a pinprick. Then being born is still a net harm. And so I don't accept that. I accept a much more contingent version, according to which didn't have to be this way. But it is, as a matter of fact, the case that the world we inhabit is just like overflowing with awfulness. And climate change, I was just reading a study today that reports that at least 1 billion people are expected to die because of climate change over the next century. I'm seeing other climatologists say, no, that's like a very conservative estimate. 4 billion is a much better estimate. So, the future looks pretty dismal. And then there's just all these social injustices in the world. There's just so much bigotry and hatred and so on. So, but it didn't need to be that way. And so that actually adds another layer of why my journey into pessimism is disappointing, because it didn't need to be this way. And pessimism is just, it's not me by disposition. The philosophy does not fit my psychology very well. But it's just, I feel like it's impossible to reject at this point. So sorry, it was a bit of a rambling response to a very excellent question.
No,
But yeah,
I actually think that's an excellent response, Emil, because I resonate with what you said. I think on a very intellectual and spiritual level, I am a pessimist as well. I share many concerns about, the human condition, the state of the world today. And yet, you're right, like on a very interpersonal level, I don't seem that way. I could still be enjoying life. I think, if you were to ask me, do I think my life is better here than never have been, I would have preferred to have my life for all the hardship, the suffering that I've gone through as well. Because I know that on a very surface level, my life is still very privileged compared to, one of the billions of people who could be suffering immense pain, and hardship, in the years to come. So, or even right now, like you said, children who are born with cancer and very unfortunate victims, right? So yeah, I think this is one of the most complex philosophical stances or attitudes a person has to grapple with. And I think, for me, I can't see myself any other way. Like, I think is what enriches one understanding and empathy with the world, and I think that can be contrasted, right, with the philosophical attitudes of your ideological opponents, the TESCREALs and long-termism, effective altruists. But let me move on to asking you the next question, because we are supposed to talk about your book. So I don't have a physical copy, but I just want to ask you, what's your intention of writing your book, Human Extinction, right? The history and the ethics of human extinction. And what do you want your readers to get out of it?
yeah, great question. I'm reminded of something that my undergraduate advisor at university told me. She said there's two basic ways to make a significant contribution to this field of philosophy, or more broadly, just humanistic inquiry. And one is to tackle a topic that's been discussed a lot, but to in some very perceptive way, see something that nobody else has seen. So you make an original contribution to, that's really hard. Another option is to find a topic that looks to be important and has been largely neglected, or maybe almost entirely neglected, and then rush in and be the first one to say something interesting about that topic. So the fact is that human extinction, this is a startling, perplexing, bizarre fact. It's been just hugely neglected. There've been almost no books written about it. The ethics of human extinction has been just completely neglected. That started to change over the past 20 years with the rise of long-termism, existential risk studies. But it's worth emphasizing individuals in the X-risk, existential risk, or long-termist communities approach the topic of the ethics of human extinction from a very particular angle. So it's not a comprehensive exploration of the field, which is what I provide in part 2 of the book. So yeah, that is sort of one motivator, one impetus behind writing the book. It's just nobody's written about this before, and that should change, especially if it's the case that, as many leading intellectual scholars would argue, the probability of extinction this century is higher maybe than ever before in our 300,000 year history on Earth. If that's the case, then surely you would want to know. Just on the one hand, you'd want to know where did this idea come from? How did it develop? On the other hand, what are the ethics? Just how bad would it be? Or maybe it would be good if we disappeared. So yeah, that's partly part of what motivated. But the other side of the coin is that I think the topic is just super interesting. And there's a kind of, at least one could argue, there's a kind of profundity to the topic itself. It's profound. I mean, it's about not just the future of us as individuals, but the species itself. Will we continue to exist if the prospect of human extinction is imminent? How does that affect our lives right now? In fact, surveys of the public show that there was one out from earlier this year. It found that 55% of Americans are somewhat worried or very worried that advanced AI could threaten our survival as a species. Similar polls report something similar with respect to climate change. Climate change being the kill mechanism rather than artificial intelligence. And so, we're in a sense many of us are living in this situation. We're like, the prospect of complete annihilation seems very real. And so how does that affect how can we live a meaningful life under these circumstances? Back in 1961, John F. Kennedy gave a talk to the United Nations, and he bemoaned the fact that we live under what he called the nuclear sword of Damocles. So, the story of Damocles, he, wants to sit in the throne. And so the king says, okay, I'll let you do that. So Damocles goes up and sits there and enjoys it. But the king points out that above you, suspended by a single horse's hair, is a large sword. And so at any point it could. So that's our situation with respect to nuclear weapons. It certainly was back in the early 1960s, but also that's kind of the world we live in with respect to climate change. Some would argue artificial intelligence as well. So how can we live a meaningful life under these circumstances? So these are all topics that are discussed in the book, and I just felt like it was important, and probably there's never been a better time for somebody to go and write the history of thinking about human extinction, and that's part one, and then the ethics. What are the ethical and evaluative implications of human extinction? That's part two.
Yeah, interesting that you put it that way, that, when you're confronted with such questions, one should be asking themselves, what's the best way to lead a meaningful life? And, philosophy provides a lot of avenues to think about that question, right? One can be existentialist, one can be deontologist, utilitarianism, there's so many other ways that a person can choose to live the morality and want to manifest, what is meaningful for them. But I guess, now that you put it that way, the question is very different if you think about human extinction, because most people think they'll live through the end of their lives, that there's a bright future for humanity still. But once you actually superimpose the notion that we may go extinct, then maybe the question becomes very different. The answers become, a lot more urgent as to, how we should actually lead our lives. And before I get to your book, right, because, you mentioned the polls, you mentioned the surveys of people feeling this existential dread, right, and anxiety. To our viewers, right, maybe some of them, may have never thought about it before. Should they be concerned? Should they actually understand that this is a very valid, real possibility that the human race can go extinct? Yeah. So we got to hook these people into our conversation.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Or they may think this is just just a abstract academic thought exercise. But
Yeah.
how would you respond to that? How would you tell our viewers, whether this is a real empirical urgency?
Yeah, I think it is. A couple things to say. One is the estimates of the likelihood of extinction this century. There's just a huge range. There are some people who believe that the chances of extinction are like 20%. Lord Martin Rees, puts the probability of civilizational collapse that may or may not entail our extinction at 50% this century. And in my view, I think the probability of human extinction is probably lower than what a lot of people suspect, because it's, there was a special issue of a journal called Futures, and this was published probably in 2007 or so. It was co-edited by a futurist named Bruce Tahn, and the goal was to contributors to imagine scenarios in which humanity goes extinct. And one of the takeaways of the special issues is actually really difficult to figure out how to kill everybody on Earth. So there are uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, there are people in Siberia, there's scientists in Antarctica, individuals in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and so on and so on. So it seems likely that that even a global catastrophe, something like thermonuclear war or catastrophic climate change, will result in there being some survivors. So my view is that the probability of human extinction is probably lower than what a lot of scholars think. But I would add that in my considered opinion, the probability of civilizational collapse is higher than Martin Rees suggested. It's very hard for me to imagine how we get through this century, given climate change and the fact that that's going to almost certainly, I believe, increase the probability of, maybe nuclear war. There's just so many. The obstacle course of threats is complexifying, and it's very dense. And they're, add in like deep fakes and lethal autonomous weapons and the spread of disinformation. Maybe pertaining to climate change, maybe pertaining to certain national security issues and so on. And that just looks like a almost hopeless threat environment. It's just so complicated and so dangerous that it's hard for me to imagine that we'll make it through with a civilization that resembles the sorts that we are accustomed to, or at least many of us in the global north are accustomed to. So I think human extinction is even if here's what I'll add. Sorry, even if the probability is fairly low, one could argue from certain ethical positions that the stakes are huge, because human extinction, some would argue this, it's not like genocide. It's not like the extermination of some group, some subgroup within the human population. It's the end of the entire human story. There's nothing after it. And so we lose, all future happiness. We lose the further development of sciences. Who knows what sort of amazing works of art could exist in the future if we were to survive. I mean, just think about all the different like musical genres that have emerged that just did not exist. There are types of music that did not exist 100 years ago. So you could extrapolate that into the future and say, I don't know, maybe there's just like marvelous new kinds of music that we just cannot even comprehend, the way Mozart could never have comprehended dubstep. And so we lose all of that. Human extinction, some would argue, it's qualitatively different. And so even if the probability is low, the stakes are so huge that it demands a certain amount of attention, certainly more attention than it's gotten. I disagree with those views as it happens, but nonetheless, I mean, there may be people listening perhaps who are or would be sympathetic with them, in which case, even if it's low probability, stakes are so huge that justifies thinking about the topic.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a good thing that you brought up the idea that there is a difference between, literal human extinction. And I think you used the term terminal human extinction or final human extinction, right? And that's very different from, say, civilizational collapse. We could still, experience great tragedy, reorganization of societies, obviously, crumbling of civilization, which also has happened in the past in our human history. But, another civilization springs forth, right? So, so that still gives some hope that humans will still continue roaming the earth. I, for myself, can't necessarily say I think that's a good thing, but let's see if we can talk a bit about that. But anyway, let me try to start with something quite big for you to try to talk about, which is, the first part of your book is about the history of thinking, Western thinking about human extinction. And you've identified, 5 periods, right? 5 different existential moods, right? So obviously, I don't want to spend too much time for us to talk so much about it, but can you just give us a brief summary, like what you've discovered and what's so important that you found in this shifting of existential public moods?
Yeah, first I would say that the words discover and found are, I think, the right ones, because I really consider this periodization of Western thinking about human extinction to be something that by just rummaging through the archives, the historical archives, just found sitting there waiting for somebody to stumble upon it. And so I think this is a sort of real feature of the actual Western history. And the basic idea is, okay, you've got the existential mood is just a kind of public mood, like the mood of our times. And it arises from a particular set of answers to fundamental questions about whether human extinction is possible, if it is possible, if it could actually happen in our world. If that's the case, how probable is it? What are the causes or the etiology? Is it natural phenomena or human actions? Is our extinction inevitable? Is the threat near term or just far in the future? And so on. So these are all questions that you could have different sets of answers to. And each existential mood, each of these 5 periods corresponds to a unique set of answers to those questions. And the claim is that what I consider to be a discovery is that the shift from one set of answers to another, in every case, happened very abruptly, within 10 years at the most, and that during these periods, when an existential mood prevailed, a particular existential mood prevailed, the answers remained remarkably stable. So there just wasn't much change within these periods, and then boom, there's a shift to a completely different existential mood. And so basically, the first mood goes back to the ancient world, and it extends all the way up until the 1850s. And it was marked by this pervasive, at times just universally accepted view that humanity is fundamentally indestructible. So it's just not possible. It's in principle, it's not possible for humanity to disappear. Some did accept that maybe we could disappear entirely, but not forever. So it would always be a temporary state of affairs. But so in fact, these same philosophers argued that inevitably we would reemerge in the future. So in a sense, we are indestructible, even though we can undergo a kind of human extinction. But really with the rise of Christianity, that's when a deeper sense of fundamental indestructibility took hold. And just extinction, even in the most minimal sense, where Homo sapiens just disappears momentarily, that was rendered just unthinkable. And so that dominated all the way up until the 1850s, when Christianity started to decline. That opened the conceptual door up to people thinking that maybe human extinction is possible. But then there's a further question: if it's possible, could it actually happen? Because it might be the case that we occupy a universe that just doesn't contain any ways that we can go extinct. It's just the way that the universe is. Just like you can't throw a rock and hit the moon. Like, it's not that that's like just fundamentally impossible. It's not like against the laws of nature. It's just that we can't do that. So maybe it's the case that we just can't go extinct. But the 1850s is when the second law of thermodynamics was discovered, and that implies that it states that isolated systems will tend towards states of greater disorder, basically, higher entropy. And so scientists realized immediately, like it's kind of stunning. They recognized right away that this means that our planet is going to become increasingly uninhabitable. So the sun is going to cool down. Earth will end up becoming just a giant snowball. Humans will migrate towards the equator to get as much solar energy as possible to survive for as long as possible, living like people do in little snow huts in northern parts of the world. But ultimately, we're going to die out. And so this was like a huge trauma. I mean, it really shook a lot of people to their core, because it was a double trauma. Because on the one hand, the decline of Christianity made people recognize that our extinction is possible. So that itself is a traumatic realization. Furthermore, the discovery of the second law said, or entailed, that our extinction is inevitable. So, oh my gosh, not only is it possible, but it's going to happen. It's just maybe not for millions of years, but at some point, can't avoid it. And so that new mood, which is marked by a sense of existential vulnerability and cosmic doom, that dominated up until really the 1950s. And so I don't want to go into too much detail because I know you want to move on to other questions. But
no, it's okay. Go
just
yep.
Okay, so just like a brief overview. Basically, when nuclear weapons were invented, obviously they were immediately recognized as a game changer, as marking just a new era in human history. Some journalists said, the bombings of Japan on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, that those are as significant as when humans first learned to create and control fire. So there's like that event, and then 1940. But nobody connected, almost nobody connected atomic bombs with human extinction. And that changed in the mid-1950s. 1954, early in March, if I remember correctly, there was a thermonuclear test in the Marshall Islands, the Pacific Ocean. And the explosive yield was 2.5 times larger than expected. And consequently, there was an international incident with Japan because there were some fishermen who ended up getting radiation sickness. But perhaps more significantly, radioactive particles were detected around the entire world. And so immediately, again, you see, when you look at the historical record, it is incredible how quickly after this kind of failed thermonuclear test, how quickly people start linking thermonuclear weapons with human extinction. They just realized that even a small-scale thermonuclear conflict could potentially pepper Earth's surface with enough radioactive particles to maybe cause our extinction. And so 1954 was just an incredible turning point. And I mean, that it was yet another psychocultural trauma. People realized, like, when this new mood emerged and solidified, and at its heart was a sense of impending self-annihilation. Impending, meaning not that it's going to necessarily happen, tomorrow, but that it could. We now have the means, the technological means to destroy us. And so this is the third existential mood, impending self-annihilation, and it just built on the previous mood. So we still had this sense, like, in the end, we're all going to die. But now, actually, we could destroy ourselves, literally next week. And so the second and most recent shift happened really in the early 1990s. And a lot of people are surprised to discover that throughout, basically since at least 1850, all the way up until the 1980s and early 1990s, the community of earth scientists, so climatologists, biologists, geologists, and so on, almost unanimously agreed that there are no natural global catastrophes. They just don't happen. There are no mass extinction events throughout history. It's not possible for a giant asteroid to strike Earth, or for a huge volcano to erupt and somehow threaten the existence of entire species. Nobody accepted that. A lot of individuals are surprised to hear that, but that's true. And it was really in the 1980s that people realized for the first time that actually a giant asteroid had in fact struck Earth 66 million years ago and killed off the dinosaurs. And so that was not unanimously accepted until 1991. And again, the shift is very abrupt. And you see right away people saying, writing, that if these natural catastrophes have happened in the past, then obviously they could happen in the future too. So we're vulnerable existentially in a way that we didn't even realize, for most of human history. So I don't know, there were people in the past who had talked about, cometary impacts and so on, but it just was not widely accepted. And then definitely from the 1850s to the early 1990s, it was rejected. And so that was the sixth existential mood, the fifth existential mood, this notion that 4th. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Thank you for correcting me. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know why I said that. Thank you. Thank you for knowing my my views better than I do, apparently. And so, yeah, and it was really marked by this sense of like vulnerability to natural hazards in the near term. You know, we could detect an asteroid next week, and potentially perish not long after. And so then the most recent shift was really triggered by two things. One is just further developments in the climate sciences, realizing that actually climate change is much worse than we expected. There was not a consensus on climate change before the late 1990s and early 2000s. So a lot of people, I think, also would be surprised to hear that. There were scientists in the 1980s who were freaking out about it, but it just wasn't a widely accepted view that anthropogenic climate change really could have catastrophic consequences. Over the past 20 years, that view has been just reinforced over and over again by study after study. So that was part of it. And the other was this shift towards thinking about emerging technologies and emerging threats, and then anticipated future technologies that could also potentially introduce unprecedented dangers to our existence. And so the heart of this new existential mood, which emerged in the early 2000s, is a sense that however perilous the 20th century was, the 21st century will be even more so. So things are not getting better. They're getting worse. We're racing into an increasingly dire situation. And so that's our current existential mood. And I suspect that people who reflect on it will agree that, yeah, I mean, it's kind of everywhere. So it's in the news, it's in lectures, there are movies expressing these sorts of anxieties. And so those are the 5 existential moods. And thanks again for correcting.
No, it's okay. That's not. I really appreciate that you running through most of it, because that way it really helps our viewers to know how much research you've done, the kind of mood, the public moods that you've identified, and I think it really helps for people to reflect on whether are they feeling it the same? Do they see also? Because even if, like you said, right, there are movies, there are intellectuals, there are books written about this existential mood that we're in right now, but there's also counter movements, right? And so whether in my opinion, politicians, global leaders, business gurus, they try to counter that, right? They try to say that, we don't have to be in a state of despair. We are still on a very rosy path to more global wealth or prosperity, and one needs to kind of call bullshit on that, right? So yeah. So just a little bit of a intellectual question, right? So obviously in your research, you covered mostly Western thinkers, and you had a very interesting comment about how, in your opinion, why haven't non-white men thought about extinction? Systematic analysis of the ethics of extinction is because this extinction causing catastrophe would directly affect them, whereas non-extinction catastrophes like global poverty and localized famines and social injustices would not. So I'm just wondering, this is just my kind of response, just as in terms of my thoughts, is it possible that it's just really like in the past, right, there have been non-Western global imperialism or civilizations, right? And maybe in just those days, yeah, there were wars, there were famines, there were great conflicts, right? But it was never really anything close to the level of a human extinction. So that's one, right? And also the other reason is because, as you identified in your research, right, with the advent of the discovery of the second law of thermodynamics, the nuclear age. So these are very much within the Western canon, Western science. And, it hasn't been non-Western, thinkers or scientists who really have access to this weapon. So they never really had to consider that they will be the ones using it, right? So that's just something I thought about. And, in a sense, you're also saying that, like, privileged people are the ones most worried about extinction because they wouldn't want to end their, their life of privilege and glory. But there have been privileged classes in non-Western societies as well. So, so what are your thoughts? Do you think there's a reason why the non-Western canon hasn't taught so much about extinction?
Yeah, so I mean, just to clarify a point, the focus is, as you mentioned, on the Western tradition. And with respect to that tradition, I'm mentioning that overwhelmingly the people who have talked about human extinction have been white men, many of them in like very privileged positions. And so, yeah, it sort of makes sense that, if I were a selfish person who mostly just cares about my own well-being, and if I'm, in some elite position at the top of the socioeconomic hierarchy, what sort of catastrophes, global catastrophes, am I going to be most worried about? Well, global poverty doesn't affect me. Maybe there are like, climate change is not going to be, that's not going to threaten Jeff Bezos, or Elon Musk, the way that it's going to threaten, people in the global South and so on. So what sort of catastrophes would affect these people? Well, it's extinction, because by definition, that results in all people ceasing to exist. Or if it's the result of a catastrophe, it means that everybody dies. So yeah, so that's sort of my working hypothesis. Although I'd really like to investigate it a bit more, and I feel like there's a feminist critique of basically the history that I put together, which could be really, really powerful and really insightful. So all of that being said, one thing I haven't looked at, or at least not closely, is actually what people in the non-Western traditions have thought about human extinction. So for me, it's just a kind of black box. I wouldn't say that it's only been people in the West, and mostly these white men who've thought about it. I just don't know. So really, a follow-up project that I would be absolutely thrilled to pursue would be to, spend several years just reading the literature from, people in China and Japan and, Africa and South America and so on, to get a better sense of how, intellectuals in these traditions have thought about, the possibility of human extinction, maybe especially, going into the second half of the 20th century. But yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and I am eager to have an answer to it. What did people who were not part of the Western tradition, how has their thinking about human extinction evolved over time?
Yeah,
Don't
I
really
think
know.
that could be your next. Yeah, I think that could be your next project. So let me actually move on to the second part, a very interesting part, obviously, of your book, right? The second part, which is the ethics, right, of extinction. And I think for me, similar to the philosopher Albert Camus, right, who said there's only one serious philosophical problem, and that to him that's suicide. I think the problem of human extinction throws up, the same serious philosophical debates, right, about values, beliefs, and ideas, right, and about the human condition and human nature. So I just thought that just to set the tone, right, you did clarify in your book that when we talk about humanity and extinction, there's also like the difference between going extinct and being extinct. So, for the sake of making our conversation digestible, so we just take it for granted that humanity just refers to Homo sapiens as we are
Mhm.
biologically today. And I know that you have thoughts that, humanity can mean other things as well. But going through just again in a kind of brief manner, like why does it matter that, we have to have the different definition of extinction, right? Like you have 6 different definitions, and why do they matter? And then I'd like you to also follow up on the idea about the difference between going extinct and being extinct.
Yeah, excellent
Yeah.
questions. So yeah, I think it's helpful to distinguish between 6 extinction scenarios. Many of these have their own unique ethical and evaluative implications. And some of the distinctions are also very important, I think, for making sense of the history of thinking about human extinction. And so, all of them are all of them build upon a minimal definition of human extinction, which is pretty straightforward. It's just that there's humans at one point in time, and then at some later point in time, there are no members of Homo sapiens existing in the universe anywhere. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. But it turns out that there are many different ways that could be instantiated. So I think the most obvious definition is just demographic extinction, whereby the human population dwindles until we're all gone. And so that could happen very quickly. Maybe if there's a thermonuclear war that caused our extinction, we would die out over the course of like a decade. There could also be, infertility scenarios where, maybe the human population dwindles over the course of 2 centuries. So there's a huge range in the rapidity in which demographic extinction could unfold. There's also phyletic extinction. That's where Homo sapiens disappears because we just evolve into one or more new post-human species. So, there's some individuals who would argue that demographic extinction, if it's permanent, that would be really bad. Some of these same individuals would say that phyletic extinction, if it results in some kind of superior, enhanced post-human species, that would be great. So one type of extinction is good, another type of extinction is very bad. And so maybe I'll just mention one more type of extinction because it's easy to just get lost in all the details. And for philosophers, disambiguating terms is like really fun. For many people, it's not. So I'll spare listeners the tedium of going through every type of human extinction. So another one that I think is really important is final human extinction. So you had mentioned that before. So this is when, for example, demographic extinction happens. And not only does Homo sapiens disappear entirely, but we also disappear forever. And then there's one more condition, which is that we don't have any successors. And so this is a type of extinction because Homo sapiens could disappear entirely and forever, but we have successors. That is a different type of that's terminal extinction without final extinction. And the reason final extinction is noteworthy is that a lot of people would argue that what happens after we disappear can make all the difference to their evaluation of how bad extinction is. So there are, computer scientists, for example, who have argued that we should create intelligent machines and then allow ourselves to die out. So we should be replaced by these intelligent machines. So that is terminal extinction. We disappear entirely and forever, but not final extinction. So they would say that, is terminal extinction bad? Well, yes, if it also involves us not having any successors, in which case it's final extinction. But terminal extinction itself, nothing bad about that. It's nothing inherently bad on their view. So this sort of gives listeners a sense of the sorts of distinctions that I think are important for sort of navigating the space. And you're totally right that I think the difference between going extinct and being extinct is really important for existential ethics. The study of the ethical and evaluative implications of human extinction. Would causing or allowing our extinction be right or wrong? Would it be good or bad? Would it be better or worse? Those are the key questions of existential ethics. And so, there are like really kind of 3 main positions within this field of existential ethics that are all of which are crucially founded on the going extinct, being extinct distinction. So just real briefly, and there are further lost views for any philosophers out there, examples would be like totalist utilitarianism, as well as long-termism. And these argue that, okay, going extinct could be a source of badness. If there's lots of suffering, if lives are cut short, that all of that would be bad. So that would make extinction itself, give it a negative sort of evaluation. But being extinct is also a source of badness. Why? Because being extinct is associated with certain opportunity costs, which I gestured at earlier. The loss of happiness, the loss of all future development in the arts and the sciences and so on. All of that would be gone. And that would be very bad. So the further loss theorists are saying there are these further losses that are also morally relevant. And those further losses are associated with this state or condition of being extinct. And so, one of the implications is that even if every human on Earth voluntarily, without any coercion at all, decided to stop having kids, so nobody's life is cut short. There's nobody's being forced. Nobody's autonomy is being violated, and so on. Further loss theorists would still say that human extinction would be really bad, even if there's nothing bad or wrong about going extinct. Extinction still entails the loss of all these further things, and so even just voluntary human extinction in this way would be really wrong and very bad. So that's one of the views. Another view is the equivalence position, which I'm most sympathetic with. And this just states that being extinct is not morally relevant. And one way of understanding this is, well, if there's nobody around to suffer or bemoan the loss of humanity, sciences, the arts, and so on, then nobody's harmed. And if nobody's harmed, how can the state or condition of being extinct be bad or wrong? Nobody's actually harmed. We're not around to go, gee, it's awful that we don't exist. So that's the equivalence view. Equivalence view says that the badness or wrongness of human extinction comes down entirely to the details of going extinct. If there's something bad or wrong about going extinct, then there's something bad or wrong about extinction. But if there's nothing bad or wrong about going extinct, then there's just nothing else to say about our extinction. Extinction is not a unique moral problem. And so then the last view is pro-extinctionism. And this just states that being extinct is in some sense better than being extant or continuing to exist. And so a lot of pro-extinctionists would agree that going extinct could be very bad. Because a lot of pro-extinctionists are not, you might have this sort of image of somebody who's ghoulish and has just like this really dark view and we should stop existing. But a lot of them are just very sensitive to suffering in the world. And so for precisely, that's why they think being extinct would be better, because there's no suffering. And it's precisely why they also would say that going extinct, if it involves a catastrophe, would be really bad. And we should try to avoid that. So the vast majority of pro-extinctionists have said the only morally acceptable way of bringing about this better state of being extinct is by voluntarily, in a non-coerced way, refusing to have children. So yeah, so that's sort of the lay of the land of existential ethics. Those are sort of fundamental distinctions.
Yeah, I appreciate you elaborating on that, because, reading your points, right, reading the book, reading your notes, it really helped me clarify like my thoughts about, whether human level extinction is preferable, on what grounds would we want to favor human level extinction, what would be the process of doing it, if we voluntarily choose to do so, or, is this something, in my view, that it could be a sense of karma, that we have done so much damage to the natural systems, to planet Earth, that in some sense we're almost morally deserving to go extinct. At least that's where my kind of thoughts are running up right now. But in any case, one of the great things I want to talk about what I learned from you is also the issue of existential hermeneutics. So I would imagine anyone listening to this right now, they would think that there can't be anybody out there who would be pro-extinction. But as you point out, actually, right, that existential hermeneutics just really means that how one person evaluates the threat of extinction is influenced by their religious or secular ideologies. And you brought up the great example of Ronald Reagan and the evangelicals, right, who cite the end times narrative of the Bible and kind of have a certain kind of keen interest to see the possibility of a thermonuclear Armageddon, right? Where scientists like Carl Sagan, philosopher Bertrand Russell, he saw it as a doomsday scenario. And that really puts to mind, that really makes you question, the whole idea that human beings don't necessarily seek to just prolong their lives without meaning. Like some ideologies actually seek the kind of termination because they find better meaning in it, or some kind of deeper meaning in it. And I guess my question to you is: does this shock you? Does this make you question about the innate goodness of human beings? When you read about people who sort of seek extinction with this kind of they're keen to go forward with it.
Yeah. So do you mean both religious people and secular
Yeah,
people?
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about like, what aspect of this, is perhaps the most interesting to you? Would it be, so for example, right, like the idea of the evangelical organizations and movement, right? Like there is obviously the religious zealotry to it. There is perhaps some might argue the irrational nature of it, right? But then you've got, as you say, secular ideologies. Obviously you were talking about Nick Bostrom, right? If I'm not wrong,
Mhm.
who would actually favor some kind of phyletic extinction, right? And in that case, that's very much supported by his scientific way of thinking about things. So, do you see any like common factors, certain values that would spur someone to be um, going forward with pro-extinction?
Yeah, excellent questions. I mean, there's a lot to say. So on the one hand, pro-extinctionists in general, the type of extinction that they're thinking about is final extinction. So if your concern is, let's say, our destructive actions in the biosphere, or the possibility there existing large amounts of suffering in the human suffering if we continue to exist, you don't solve those problems if we disappear, but we have some successor species. That, I mean, maybe it's possible that the successor species wouldn't suffer and actually would be a good steward of planet Earth. But the surest way to guarantee that there's no more destruction or suffering is through final extinction. And I, I mean, I have to say that I find a lot of these figures to be uh, kind of sympathetic in a certain way. I mean, there have been pro-extinctionists who have advocated for essentially really violent, um,
Means.
positions. Yeah, omnicide, the murder of everyone. And so that I think is a horrendously awful position. That shouldn't even need to be stated. But for a lot of the other pro-extinctionists who embrace this view that we should just stop procreating, I don't know. It's not hard for me to be somewhat sympathetic because a lot of them really are just very sensitive to human suffering and just all of the the terrors and traumas and agony and anguish that is kind of an inevitable. Maybe it's not inevitable. Maybe this goes all the way back to contingent pessimism. Maybe it's the world doesn't need to be this way, but it just is this way, and there's no reason to think that might change in the future. To the contrary, things will probably get a lot worse this century. So I sort of, I don't know. I relate in a certain sense with where they are in their heart, in just being really concerned about human misery. There are other views that I'm much less sympathetic with. So you mentioned like the Silicon Valley people. There are a surprising number of individuals who believe that if Homo sapiens disappeared entirely and forever this century, that would be not a bad thing at all, so long as we have some kind of machine, computer successors. This is a common view. In his book, The Survival of the Richest, Douglas Rushkoff goes into great detail talking about the various individuals who embrace what he calls the mindset, or what I would call TESCREAlism. And yeah, so they imagine the future being digital, not biological. Biological humans are maybe there a few of us will get we'll get to stick around in pens or as pets or something, but digital is that is the next stage of cosmic evolution. And so this is a kind of human extinction that they're advocating. I mean, there's almost a sense in which you could say that they're a kind of pro-extinctionist. They just don't advocate for final extinction. So these are, yeah, I worry a lot about these people, and I strongly reject their views. And then maybe the last thing worth mentioning has to do with this existential hermeneutics, which is just sort of foregrounding the idea that whether one interprets the hazards around us through a religious or a secular lens matters. So I just imagine the one's mapping of the threat environment is what happens when you project risks through these lenses or hermeneutical lenses, you could say. And so it is absolutely fascinating that, and this is precisely why the decline of Christianity in the 19th century was so important, because it enabled people to look at things like the second law and say, this implies a secular apocalyptic event, human extinction, rather than this somehow fits into God's grand plan for the universe and for humanity, in which we will survive. We always, in every interpretation of Christian apocalypse narratives, humanity survives. We end up in heaven or in hell forever. So that's the opposite of human extinction. And so, yeah, I mean, in the middle of the 20th century, although Western society was being secularized quite a bit, there still were people who embraced, Christian, kind of extreme radical interpretations of Christianity. Reagan was one of them. And as a result, these people did not understand, did not interpret nuclear weapons as threats to our survival. Rather, they were seen as fulfillments of prophecy. And so you even have, Ronald Reagan saying during a 1971 dinner when he was governor of California, saying that nuclear weapons are a fulfillment of prophecy in Ezekiel, whereby like we're just engulfed in flames and flesh melts off our bodies and so on. And so this hermeneutics, it really matters in terms of how one maps out the threat environment. You've got a religionist like Ronald Reagan who's saying actually the threat environment's just not, it's just completely different than somebody like Carl Sagan around the same time who is an atheist, looking at nuclear weapons and saying actually this could genuinely bring about our complete annihilation. So yeah, I mean that's I hope that's all those points cohered. But again, I'm just sort of gesturing at the diversity of views and the richness of this topic.
All right. So for those of you who are watching and realizing that Émile and me are now in different clothes, it's because yes, we have different wardrobes, but it's not in the same session. So what happened really is that Émile has been so kind to follow up because we ran out of time with the previous conversation. And so I really want to thank Émile for coming back on because we had such an interesting point in our conversation that I didn't want to let it drop and die out. So once again, Émile, thanks for coming back on.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, sure. So
Appreciate
anyway,
it.
I just want to, yeah. So I mean, we were at such an interesting point of conversation. So just wanted to respond to what you were talking about, which is the richness and diversity of views, about human existence and human extinction. And you were expressing sympathies, right, with certain pro-extinctionists, in that philosophical, pessimistic sense. And for me, what I wanted to respond was, this kind of thoughts come up in kind of anecdotal ways for me. So just to give you one very brief example, several years ago, there was this Marvel superhero movie called The Avengers. And in that movie, there was a major villain, Thanos, which wanted to eradicate half of the universe, half the population of the universe, and for ostensibly altruistic reasons, because he saw the devastation of his people in his home planet due to overpopulation. And back then around me, people, my friends, would relate this issue in a way that's close to our reality and debate about the problems of overpopulation or the ethics of population control. And concurrently, also at the same time, due to the exploitative nature of the capitalist system, our consumerist culture, some of us could argue justifiably, right, that human extinction could be very beneficial for other species and maybe even the planet in some sense. Then, of course, there is this worrying sense as well, right, among politicians and capitalists that in some societies like Japan, Singapore, Korea, even in a place like Australia, that the population is not producing enough babies. And, this can contribute obviously to people having real economic and existential anxieties, right, about the future, and they don't see this optimistic future, right? And we can safely, of course, imagine that it's not like huge swaths of people have become anti-natalistic or have gotten to know about David Benatar. And, David Benatar's anti-natal philosophy has swept the world, right? So it's not really because of that. It's really due to this, what I would consider an outgrowth of the difficult and stressful times that we are in. And so I guess what I want to say was, to summarize all this is how pertinent the topic of human extinction is, right? In how it can come to us in this kind of very um, subtle ways, right? And that the man on the street is not reading philosophy or necessarily contemplating the scale of human existence, but we can develop sympathies for what's so wretched about the human condition, or about, say, the system that we live in, the times that we live in, and understand why our demise can actually be distinctly deleterious or beneficial. So that's what I wanted to say. Do you have something to say before I move on to um, a question? Yeah, to what I just mentioned.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I wouldn't consider myself to be pro-extinctionist. But you're right that, I have some sympathies with the underlying views that have led many pro-extinctionist philosophers to their pro-extinctionism. So, you mentioned our deleterious impact on the environment. My thought about that is actually it's not so much that humanity should be blamed, but it's really the wealthy individuals, the socioeconomic elite. I mean, the studies show that they're overwhelmingly responsible for the destruction of the natural world. So I'm not sure. I mean, there is a possible world in which wealth inequality is reduced and the carbon impact, carbon footprint of humanity is reduced to a sustainable amount. In which case, so maybe it's not that humanity itself is incompatible with the biosphere flourishing, but just the particular systems we have that enable a relatively small group of individuals to have this huge disproportionate impact that is really destructive on the environment. And so beyond that, that's sort of environmentalist considerations that might lead one to pro-extinctionism. But also then with respect to, being extinct, being better than being extant. Yes, I'm a little bit sympathetic with the philosophical pessimists who, just life is very bad. And consequently, if we no longer existed, then all of the suffering and the horrors, and in particular certain types of suffering that one could argue no amount of happiness could possibly counterbalance. So things like child abuse or torture and so on. Some would argue that even if in the future or even contemporarily there is overall a huge amount of happiness alongside the existence of these extraordinary, unthinkable evils, then the world still isn't worth it, And so, yeah, I'm not totally convinced by the pro-extinctionist claim that we ought to try to bring about our extinction, but also, maybe there's a bit of a silver lining if humanity ceases to exist, because that would entail that the worst human experiences and the worst human evils also would no longer exist. So that's kind of my it's a little bit, I mean, maybe it's a bit too charitable to call it nuanced, but it's a bit of a nuanced view, what one might say. So yeah.
No, yeah, no, I think it's very nuanced. And let me go into this actually, because it's actually one of the questions I have set up. It's meant to be the last question, but I want to talk about it now since you brought it up. So, you like I mentioned before, the essay that really, made me attracted to talking to you, right? That attracted me to your writing is the one that you wrote about the bright side of extinction. And I just want to quote the last words of your essay, right? You write about how when you reflect on the views of the pessimist philosophers, you feel in your gut the tragedy of a world with no humans, no laughter, friendship, love, poetry, music, or philosophy. And beautifully, you write, I'm quoting here, humanity is this little gem in the infinite darkness of space, and to lose that gem would be to deprive the universe of perhaps the most unique thing that it envelopes. But then you reflect on the words of philosopher Bernard Williams, and he's someone that I like to read as well, who asks us to conceive of an idea about mountains of misery and ask, surely we want to annihilate that, right? And that's where I feel like we speak pessimistically, but truthfully that, the vast majority of us as passive spectators in the world, we can't abolish, nuclear arsenals, fossil fuel companies to stop extracting oil. And so, we should take heart that, and here I quote your words, because the light of human consciousness casts a dark shadow, and without light, there is no shadow, and a world without shadows might just be best. And those words really move me. That's why I really wanted to sort you out to speak to you about it. So can I just ask you, how did you arrive at this thought process, and furthermore, what has been the reception to your article, whether it's among your friends, other philosophers, other thinkers, do they generally have the same feelings of like, yeah, you're speaking some kind of truth here, even though it's very hard to reconcile with?
Yeah, great questions. I mean, I think I believe I mentioned this at the beginning of our conversation, that when I was young, I had this experience being told that, millions of people starve every year. There are children who die of brain tumors. They're innocent. They didn't do anything to deserve it. They suffer greatly. They're scared. They go through surgeries and then they still perish. And so, yeah, as a kid, I sort of formulated this Schopenhauerian hypothesis that, maybe the world actually is quite bad and existence is no good. And because the philosophy of pessimism does not naturally fit with my natural disposition towards optimism and cheerfulness, and I basically tried, for the next 3 decades of my life, very hard to disprove the hypothesis. And then I don't know, there are just some personal experiences over the past 5 years that have been very challenging. And in some of those moments when I felt very depressed by the state of the world, sad by events that have occurred in my own personal history, I've thought, maybe the state of mind I'm in right now is not the best one to make some kind of judgment about the goodness and badness of the world. Alternatively, maybe it is. Maybe there's no better state than when one is feeling really down and out and kind of hopeless and pessimistic for reasons that have nothing to do with one's disposition, but just have to do with the state of the world and one's personal experiences. So maybe it's actually, that's the best moment too, because there are people all around the world every moment having those exact experiences. Even when I then feel better in the future and things are going well and I feel good about my own situation, the world nonetheless contains just unfathomable number of those types of awful experiences at any given moment. So that, I don't know, that reflecting on these issues had a big impact. I mean, also I've had a number of friends who've passed away, and those situations also greatly influenced my thinking. There was one friend who I plan on writing about it at some point, because I actually have a draft of an article that addresses the question: is the world good or is it bad? What does it even mean to say that? How would we go about answering this kind of deep, profound question? And so, yeah, I mean, just this friend of mine had, he got married, fell in love, got married. A few months later, wife was diagnosed with brain cancer. She died, I don't know, 6 months later after a very atrocious, awful struggle. So obviously, as one would expect, he was really devastated. And then and by the way, there's sort of a trigger warning on this story, because it is very heavy. So, he sort of bounced back, started dating another woman who I believe cheated on him, although I'm not 100% sure about that. And so they broke up, and then he disappeared. and nobody knew where he was. And there were all sorts of posts on social media like, I'll call him John, have you seen John? He's been missing for a week. There were no real signs that he was going to leave or going to do something. And then the police found him. He drove, I don't know, 4 hours north of the city in which he lived to the graveyard where his ex-wife was buried, and he killed himself, and he shot himself. And so like that story, just like, I mean, that was so devastating. I wasn't super close with him, but we talked pretty regularly online. I never met him in person, but I mean, I considered him a friend. And that was one of several stories that are just so tragic that it forced me to contemplate a bit more seriously this Schopenhauerian hypothesis. Just the question of like, how can the world be described as good if things like that happen? Because that is, I just can't imagine the depths of despair and despondency and misery that this poor individual was going through. So that story haunts me, and it's my own experiences with like tragedy, and then knowing about these situations that friends of mine have been in. That is what has led me to take seriously, in a way I didn't before, this notion that being extinct might be better. Because if there are no more humans, then there are no more tragedies like what John went through. And I don't know, I feel the pull of that. I sort of can't help it. I feel the moral tug of the seriousness of this experience that he went through. So that's sort of what has swung open the door to me taking seriously this pro-extinctionist view. And just to be clear, and I think I was before when we spoke earlier, that this is just bracketing the details, bracketing questions pertaining to going extinct, right? So you can say that being extinct would be better than being extant, but also say that the only ways from here to this future state of no longer existing are awful. And they're so awful that we should avoid them at just about any cost. And so that is sort of the view that I defend in the book, even if one says that, sure, there's an upside to us no longer existing. All of the paths that take us there are just so horrendous that we should do everything in our power to, in practice, prevent human extinction. And so, yeah, just to be clear about that point. So I think you asked two questions. I think I just answered the first one. Just remind me what the second one was.
Just really what the reception has been, right? Among leaders, right? Other philosophers, or maybe even your friends, peers, family.
Yeah. So, I honestly haven't spoken to a whole lot of people about this. I do have a colleague named Simon Knutson, who's a graduate student right now, I believe somewhere in Scandinavia. I can't remember the exact country, but does some really, he is an outright philosophical pessimist. And a lot of his writings I find to be very compelling in certain ways. I mean, he's incredibly sensitive to suffering in the world, and also is of this view that actually his particular view is that I hope I'm not misrepresenting him, is that being extinct would be very, very bad, but being extant is worse. So it would be awful if we went extinct, but it would be better than if we continue to exist. That said, he also is very emphatic about what the morally permissible routes to human extinction might be. And, omnicide is absolutely profoundly immoral. Nobody should try to destroy humanity in some sort of involuntary manner. Antinatalism is maybe the only morally permissible route, but that's just never going to happen. Just not going to convince enough people to not to refrain from procreating. So, yeah, I've had many conversations with him, and that have helped to clarify my thinking. But overall, I mean, a lot of philosophers, I think, just really haven't thought that much about this issue. And there's sort of this reflexive recoiling away from this idea of human extinction potentially being good. And I sort of understand that. I think part of it is a conflation of going extinct and being extinct. So, if you hear a pro-extinctionist say, yeah, it would be better if we no longer existed, one might immediately imagine some kind of homicidal, ghoulish, violent, awful person, when in fact a lot of pro-extinctionists are deeply moved by the existence of human suffering. And for precisely that reason, they think omnicide would be a tremendous, unspeakable evil. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't have much to report in terms of the reaction. I mean, yeah, except to say that a lot of people who are presented with this idea that perhaps being extinct might be better than being extant just have a kind of immediate, allergic response to like, no, that sounds like really dark and awful. But perhaps if they thought about it more, they'd be a little more sympathetic to, essentially the view that I think Bernard Williams was gesturing at, even though he says we should annihilate humanity, which that's a normative claim that I strongly reject. But the idea behind his claim is just that if we had any sense of how much suffering there is in the world, then we would say, yeah, it'd be better if humanity didn't exist. And so, yeah, perhaps if philosophers were to reflect a bit more on the quantity and types, the quality of suffering in the world, then they'd be a bit more sympathetic to it.
Yeah, so much to respond there. So let me first say a few things that you mentioned earlier on, right? Because you mentioned like maybe one should look at the state of suffering in the world and be careful about how one attributes, its causality, right? So you could say it's not humanity, but it's really the socio-economic systems or cultural systems that we live in that are very exploitative or colonialist, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly on our channel, actually, we've spoken quite a lot on degrowth. I myself personally am an advocate of the degrowth social movement. So, many of you pointed out about how it's really the rich and the wealthy that are contributing the most, right, to environmental destruction, carbon emissions. But, as much as I agree with all that, right, like this is the reality that we face in, but there's also the more philosophical sense of me asking, why aren't more people concerned about this? Why aren't people more outraged at the injustice of it? And this is what, has pulled me towards philosophical pessimism about the human condition, that we are somehow not morally compelled, to act in ways that would have been more just and equitable and egalitarian. And of course, there's many other kind of books, studies, and arguments out there about how we are a pro-social species and stuff like that. But but one can't just look at the world as it is right now and see that pro-socialness is actually contributing to the overall good, right? And I understand that's a very difficult question to answer, but yeah, but if one is sensitive to the sufferings of the world, one can make a categorical conclusion that, hey, this is all for the better, or this is the best of all possible worlds, right? Which is how some philosophers like to imagine.
Yeah.
And then that you mentioned, about how you are careful about being in a certain kind of depressive mood and making a philosophical judgment. In psychology, right, it's said that those who are depressed have a closer sense of the reality. They have a closer sense of themselves, about what are like to other people, how much they contribute to the world. And so, I think, yeah, philosophy, philosophizing needs that kind of nuance and that kind of deliberation, what moods or emotions contribute to a certain judgment. But at the same time, those moods and feels, right, like it shouldn't be disregarded as, oh, you are sad, so what you're saying right now isn't true. So I think there's something to be said about all that. And lastly, I just want to say you've been so absolute, categorical in what you've been saying this whole conversation about how you are not, advocating homicide. And I definitely believe the last part of the conversation clarify again those views. So don't worry about that. Where I want to go, right, is my last question kind of on this topic. Because in your essay, right, there is one philosopher that I'm really particularly sympathetic to in terms of his argumentation, and that's Peter Wessel Zapffe. I hope I got that right.
I
But
think it's Zapffe, but I might be wrong. I think it's Zapffe.
I speak with an
Yeah.
accent, so I'm not gonna get all things right. So
Yeah.
anyway, right, as you pointed out, he argued that humanity is kind of like the Irish ilk, right?
Mhm.
And that people speculate that the ilk has evolved a set of antlers that has become too heavy for it to hold its head up, and consequently went extinct. In other words, it became over-evolved. And Zeff thought the same thing happened to humanity with respect to our consciousness, right?
Mhm.
That human beings have developed some kind of consciousness that's very unique and over-evolved, and it results in feelings of cosmic panic. And from there, he distilled certain kind of responses that one could say are quite egoistic and selfish, and for one's self-interest. Now, just to say, I found this argumentation very similar in a really recent book by animal connection behavior scientist and author Justin Gregg, who wrote the book
Mhm.
"If Nature Were a Narwhal: What Animal Intelligence Reveals About Human Stupidity," which is just to simplistically put, his argument is that we have an over-evolved human intelligence that does us more harm than good, and that if you just look at evolutionary success, right, you don't need to be a smart animal. So look at
Mhm.
crocodiles, because they're the dumbest creatures around, but they live way longer than us, right? And probably will if we were to go extinct. So my question to you, having heard all this, is, do you find these kind of arguments, powerful, potent? Do you think they say something about, where we have a certain kind of hubris, right, about our capabilities, our abilities? And I guess also on the flip side, um, does this also say something about how the solution isn't that we need to develop better intelligences? So it's not about us being smarter than what we really are. Or even in certain philosophical circles, right? There's this advocation that we must transcend the higher state of consciousness. And somehow, to me, I feel like the answer isn't that simple.
Yeah, all really fascinating points. I mean, I'm a fan of Zapf's work. It's really thoughtful and deep and poetic, oftentimes, and quite moving in a way that philosophy isn't always. Um, and yeah, you're totally right that we have this over-evolved consciousness, that's the claim, which has become maladaptive. So we are able to experience a sense of cosmic anxiety and panic in a way that no other creature can. I think he says something about all uh, organisms, or many organisms, tremble before death, but we're the only creatures who can be completely safe and still be gripped by this extraordinary intense fear of the fact that at some point we will no longer exist. I mean, I believe I would need to think just for a moment, but I think it was Schopenhauer who mentioned that, okay, life is very bad. Or maybe this was really foregrounded by Benatar, who I have very mixed feelings about, to say the least, about some of his other work. But his antinatalism is sort of interesting. That we life is very difficult and full of miseries and so on, and so you might think that death would bring some kind of sweet release. But for many of us, we're terrified of death, and that's just the icing on the cake. It's just yet another reason why it would be better for us never to have existed, because we're here and then we suffer a lot, and you know the only exit in this jail cell that we're of existence that we're stuck in is death. It's not pleasant. So just from start to finish, it's a really unfortunate predicament that we're all in. So yeah, I don't know. I find the arguments to be from Zapffe in particular to be really thoughtful, and I think he might be onto something. We do have these defense mechanisms. Actually, the defense mechanisms he mentions ties into, I think, why, to what I was mentioning before with respect to some of the reactions that philosophers have, where they just kind of don't want to think about it, or don't want to take seriously this idea that maybe if humanity did exist, that might be better. Because one of the defense mechanisms is isolation. It's that's the term he uses. It's just to sort of bury these dark, disturbing thoughts in the back of our minds, and to do everything we can to prevent them from bubbling into our consciousness. So, yeah, I mean, he mentions if it weren't for these defense mechanisms that we have to keep in operation at all times, then no doubt humanity would have disappeared long ago in how did he put it? Like fits, fits of raging insanity, just confronting the existential terrors of human existence and the fact that we're all, we all have an expiration date stamped on our lives. So yeah, I don't know. I'm sympathetic. I think Zapffe in particular is really worth reading, because his, particularly this little vignette that he opens his essay "The Last Messiah" with, which is so moving, about this, it's a bit dated, but essentially about this hunter-gatherer who feels this camaraderie with all life, and he goes out to hunt and finds himself unable to kill. And then, he comes home that evening with no food, and the following night they find him dead by the waterside under a full moon, something. So yeah, it's pretty moving, and I think captures in a poignant and powerful way this idea that life is tragic and in a pretty deep way.
Yeah, I read that essay quite some time back. I wish there were more works of him, and more people coming out accessible, whether it's the biographies or compilation of works. But he seems like quite a difficult, in terms of the materials out there, it's quite difficult to locate them. So
It is.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I just want to say a few things and then move on to the next topic about transcrealism, which is, so for Zapffe, one thing that you concluded about him is that he practiced what he preached because he chose to be
Mhm.
childless for 90
Mhm.
years of on this, for 90 years of his life. So that's one. And the second thing I wanted to say was, I really wanted to emphasize this, is to thank you so much for sharing that personal experiences, in our conversation. I always find that when we talk philosophy, it's important to know where the person comes from. No human being operates on on an abstract plane. So it's very obvious that, this kind of personal stories evoke and reinforce, the kind of ideas and beliefs that we have. And I always appreciate when someone shares something that powerful and moving and deeply personal. So
May I
moving on
mention
from there,
something real fast, if you don't
yeah,
mind? Just
yeah,
that
go ahead.
I know there's a push by some philosophers to try to incorporate in the scholarly literature, the peer-reviewed literature, more personal firsthand experiences. And I like that also, because one's lived experiences, one's personal past. There are times or situations in which that is not easily divorced from one's views. And so I completely agree. It's good sometimes to know where exactly people are coming from. I know that there have been some Owen Flanagan, for example, and Gil, a few other philosophers who have written about, for example, yeah, go ahead.
Well, you mentioned one author that he really has been writing something very powerful about suicide, and that's Clancy Martin, if I got his name right.
Ah,
How Not to Kill Yourself. He's written a very powerful book about suicide because he's made several suicidal attempts. Yeah, and he's a philosopher as well. So it's really, really good. A lot of personal anecdotes, a lot of personal stories, and he really looks at, like, why do celebrities, right, like the lead singer of Linkin Park, why do people like that commit suicide, right? Even though
mhm.
you could argue, why would someone in that kind of status, that kind of privileged status, even think about death, right? So yeah, but just to mention one person in particular.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that person's work,
Yeah.
but the book sounds super intriguing. I mean, I'd really love to read it. Really, all I'm familiar with right now is some people discussing addiction from,
Hmm.
like alcoholism is quite common in academia, whether people acknowledge it or not. But there are a number of individuals who, have struggled with alcohol or drug addiction, and then written about their experience uh, from a first person perspective. And I don't know, that's data that is useful in terms of, useful for philosophizing, not just for those individuals, but for others. So yeah, I'm very much on the same page that I would love to see more accounts of how philosophers ended up with particular views given their specific experiences in life.
Right. So let's go on to the next personal experience for yourself, which is, your dabble or participation with TESCREALism. So just to break it down for our listeners, right? It stands for, okay, so it's an acronym, right? And it stands for Transhumanism, Extropianism, Singularitarianism, what a word, Cosmism, Rationalism, Effective Altruism, and Long-termism. So look, obviously we can't get through all of them in detail, right? And we don't really have to do that. So just for, just to kick off discussing this topic, right? I'd like you to summarize what the essential features of this movement of movements are, right? And talk about why you're such a strong vocal critic of it, right? As mentioned, I think I mentioned in the introduction, you were once a transhumanist, or consider yourself a transhumanist, long-termist, but since 2009, critic. And just to share about viewers, because I just saw this on Twitter, right? Your expertise on this topic is so valuable because you'll be giving a talk to UNESCO about the dangers of this movement. So go ahead, tell us what's so wrong.
Yeah, singularitarianism is a word one needs to practice. Yeah, a few times to actually get it to roll off the tongue. Yeah, so I mean, this is a bundle of overlapping interrelated ideologies. I would describe transhumanism as the backbone of the bundle. And if that's the case, then long-termism is sort of the galaxy brain that sits atop, because it sort of binds together all of these strands and themes that are prominent in prior ideologies. And so another reason this clunky acronym TESCREAL is somewhat useful is that the letters of the ideologies correspond to essentially the chronology of when those ideologies emerged. So transhumanism is the oldest ideology. Extropianism is the first organized transhumanist movement, and then so on all the way up to long-termism, which is, in certain respects, at least, it's the most recent. The most recent ideology connected with this bundle to have appeared. And so basically, transhumanism is the idea that we should use advanced technologies to radically re-engineer the human species, ultimately to create a superior new species of posthumans. So these posthumans might be immortal or, superhumanly intelligent, or have perfect control of their emotions, and so on and so on. The next three letters in the acronym, the extropianism, singularitarianism, and cosmism, are basically just kind of versions of transhumanism. Singularitarianism emphasizes the role that super intelligent AI might play in bringing about this kind of utopian future in which we colonize space and merge with machines and so on. Cosmism is similar. It has this broader kind of cosmic vantage point, but there isn't necessarily so much of an emphasis on AI. So rationalism is then basically this idea which was founded by some transhumanists and singularitarians and extropians. And it's this idea that, okay, if our goal ultimately is to colonize space and become radically enhanced posthumans, that means that a lot of quote unquote smart people will have to do some very quote unquote smart things, inventing these technologies, figuring out how to properly use them or regulate them and so on. So rationalism is an attempt to figure out ways to optimize our rationality. And by optimizing our rationality, then we'll be better positioned to ensure that this vast and glorious future, to quote the TESCREAList named Toby Ord, to ensure that this vast and glorious future is fully realized. And then EA is basically what happens when rationalism pivots from focusing just on the domain of rationality to also focusing on the domain of morality. So whereas rationalists want to optimize rationality, effective altruists want to optimize our morality. How do we do the most good in the world? And so that sounds really nice until you look at the details and realize that effective altruism launched people like Sam Bankman-Fried to go work on Wall Street and then to get into crypto. and then to cut some corners in order to, ensure that the long-term future of humanity goes well. And as listeners no doubt know, Sam Bankman-Fried is now facing multiple felony charges and faces, I can't remember, but more than a century in prison if he's found guilty. So long-termism then it was founded by transhumanists like Bostrom, but it really emerged out of the EA movement. So the idea behind long-termism is that the future of humanity could be enormous. So, we could remain on Earth for another billion years or so. If we spread into space, then, the future could extend for at least like 10 to the 40 years. That's when protons are expected to decay. So that's a 1 followed by 40 years. It's an enormous amount of time. If protons don't decay, then the future could be, twice as long. And so if the future could be really huge, then the future human population could be enormous. So if you're an EA who wants to positively influence the greatest number of people, and if most people who could exist will exist in the far future, then it's only rational for the EA, for the altruist to focus on the very far future rather than the present. So even if there's a low probability of affecting a small portion of the future human population, the expected value of that may still be way greater than a very high probability of solving global poverty today. So that's the idea with long-termism. And if you read, what the long-termists write, you'll see a lot of them are not just concerned about the quantity of the future, bringing into existence astronomical amounts of value, but also improving the quality of individual lives. And so that's where transhumanism enters the picture in a really big way. So there could be a huge number of people, but also through these radical enhancement technologies, the people who exist in the future could be, maybe we abolish suffering. So nobody suffers anymore. They never die. So the evil of death, the harms of death are not something that anybody, will ever experience. And so on and so on. So there's, qualitative and quantitative aspect to this picture of the future. And so ultimately at the core of the TESCREAL bundle is a techno-utopian vision. So it's utopian because the future could be awesome and it could contain near infinite amounts of value. And it's techno-utopian because technology is the vehicle that will take us there. It's by developing advanced technologies we're able to radically re-engineer the human organism, as well as colonize space, create huge computer simulations in which there are just trillions and trillions of digital people living happy lives and so on. So this techno-utopian vision is at the very heart of the TESCREAL bundle. And it's that vision that is at least a main reason why I think that the TESCREAL bundle of ideologies is really dangerous, and I'm very worried about it.
Yeah, so you did a great job explaining, the history and the definitions of each of them. But someone listening to this could be a techno-optimist and say, "What's wrong with that, Emile? What's wrong with having a future where we colonize space, we become robots, we abolish suffering, we eat, just to take an Aldous Huxley, reference, we eat happy pills that will never let us sink into depression." So what's your response? What's wrong with this picture?
Yeah. So, yeah, what's wrong with nobody ever explains why these digital people living in vast computer simulations would actually be happy. Maybe they'll take like digital Prozac or something. It's not clear. But so yeah, I think there are a number of problems. One is this vision, I think, is just deeply impoverished. So one thing that you might note if you peruse the TESCREAL literature is that there's virtually zero reference to what the future ought to look like from the perspectives of, for example, feminism or Afrofuturism or indigenous traditions or disability or queerness and so on and so on. So there's just no, there isn't a deep, serious discussion about where these perspectives and these communities would fit in this future. Fundamentally, this vision is built on deeply Western, Baconian capitalistic notions of subjugation, control, exploitation, and maximization. More is always better. The greater the future human population, the better. The more happy experiences there are, the better. And so it's a deeply Western kind of view of what the future ought to look like that was devised almost entirely by white men at elite universities. And so who are not only unfamiliar with a lot of the literatures having to do with like indigenous futures or Afrofuturism and so on, but even worse, I've seen no indication that they're even curious about these alternative perspectives. And so this is one reason why I've argued that the realization of their particular techno-utopian vision, I think, would be catastrophic to most of humanity. It's just a very homogenized, very one-dimensional view about what the future should be. And a lot of the richness and diversity and strangeness of human cultures and the human experience, I think, just end up getting erased in this future. So even if they get what they want, I think that would be really, really bad. I mean, it brings to mind this notion that it's fairly easy to come up with dystopian scenarios that pretty much everybody can agree about. But it's really difficult to come up with a utopian world that more than just a few people would want to live in. For the most part, a lot of utopian worlds are quite dystopian for the majority of people. So I think that's one reason I worry about it. Also, just the pursuit of utopia could itself be dangerous. I mean, over and over again throughout human history, there have been utopian movements that have left a trail of destruction in their wake. And one reason for that is if you believe that the future contains, near infinite amounts of value. And if it's the case that there are various obstacles standing between you and this extremely valuable utopian future, then what exactly is off the table? This is how utopian movements end up being violent and engaging in, all sorts of atrocities, maybe even genocidal actions. So, one of the reasons that I left the long-termist movement, and I would more generally the sort of TESCREAL movement, is that I started to read about these utopian movements that became violent, and just realized that at their core, at the core of many of these utopian ideologies are two components. One is this, of course, a utopian vision of the future marked by infinite or near infinite amounts of value. And then other is a kind of broadly utilitarian mode of moral reasoning, according to which the ends can at least sometimes justify the means. And if you put those together, you've got everything needed for a true believer in this utopian vision to say, well, okay, yes, it's a bit of genocide or a bit of like mass murder or something else that is morally abhorrent. But the stakes are so huge that I, as a true believer, feel justified. And so, yeah, those two ingredients are right there at the heart of the TESCREAL bundle. And so I became really alarmed that some true believers in this TESCREAL worldview might feel justified and compelled to engage in extreme actions. And initially when I raised these concerns, it was back in 2021, there was an Eon article. And the worries were merely hypothetical. And if you fast forward to 2023, that's really no longer the case, because you have people like Eliezer Yudkowsky, who has been in this TESCREAL movement pretty much from the start, because he was an extropian again, first organized transhumanist movement. He was an extropian back in the 1990s. And so, yeah, he is very much an exponent of this particular vision of the future, and initially believed, as many TESCREALists did, that artificial superintelligence will usher in this utopian world. And it's the shortest way to get us from where we are right now to where we want to be in the future. But then in the 2000s, became concerned that actually building a safe superintelligence might be way more difficult than we might have naively thought. And so he now is he's one of the most prominent doomers, sounding the alarm that if we create artificial general intelligence in the near future under anything like the current circumstances, it will quickly become a superintelligence and just destroy humanity by default. And so if humanity is destroyed, then this entire techno-utopian future is obliterated along with us. It's erased before we ever have a chance to begin drawing it. That is very bad, because we're talking about astronomical amounts of value. So what's off the table to prevent that? He wrote in this Time magazine article from earlier this year that states should be willing to engage in military strikes against data centers to prevent AGI from being created in the near future, even at the risk of triggering a thermonuclear conflict. And so he then was asked on Twitter about this. A lot of people were pretty alarmed, as they should be. And he was asked, quote, how many people are allowed to die to prevent AGI from being built in the near future? And his response was, so long as the human population doesn't dip below what's called the minimum viable population. So below that, there's no hope of the human population rebounding. There just isn't enough genetic diversity or something of that sort. So long as we stay above that, and the people who exist are in sufficiently close contact that they can keep humanity going and ultimately increase the human population and rebuild civilization, then, quote, there's still a chance of reaching the stars someday. So what is the minimum viable population? It's maybe like 40,000. So what he's saying is that, the global population right now is like 8 billion and I don't know, a million or something. So he's literally, if you take his words literally, he's saying that more than 8 billion people should be allowed to die to prevent AGI. And why? Because what matters is that we ultimately reach the stars today, create this post-human utopian world in which we all live forever, and there's just astronomical amounts of value. That is what really matters. Preserving that is the most important thing. And if that means maybe engaging in military strikes that risk killing billions of people, we should be willing to do that. So my concerns were initially quite hypothetical. These days, not so much. And in fact, there's even evidence that some in the community have started to take seriously the possibility of targeted assassinations of AI researchers to slow down progress on AGI, which, that's homicide. It's an extreme act, but again, we're talking about preserving and protecting utopia. So yeah, so this is another reason why I left the community and am now very critical of it, and am trying to sound the alarm that actually the core features of the TESCREAL worldview have everything needed to justify in the minds of true believers extreme actions that might end up causing profound harm in the world, all in the name of this techno-utopian future.
Yeah, I mean, I really would advise our viewers to check out your articles. So, I guess the major one I would say is the acronym behind our wildest AI dreams and nightmares is on Truthdig, and Dangerous Visions, How the Quest for Utopia Could Lead to Catastrophe on salon.com. I would really advise viewers to look up details, because you just mentioned one tidbit of the kind of ideas and extreme actions they're willing to take in pursuit of their vision. So that's one thing I want to mention. Then I just want to give two examples I thought of based on what you just shared. So one example is, you talk about how this pursuit of homogeneity, right, using AI and creating a sort of post-human. This is a very simple, glib example, but I just saw an article where a Asian woman tried to use an AI tech to beautify herself, and it made her white. So,
Ah,
so that's a very simple one, but it rings true to what you're saying about homogeneity. Like these tools, like AI tools, they're not appreciative. They can't be made or designed to think of human richness, diversity, and all that, right? They subscribe to a certain algorithm or a certain way or formula which the designers have chosen, right? So
mhm.
that's one way that you could see this very homogenized future that is ignorant of as you say, human richness and diversity. And then of course the other thing I thought of was actually the philosopher giant Peter Singer, and he was actually in a debate some years back. And just for viewers who don't know, Peter Singer is a animal ethicist and effective altruist, right? But in this Oxford Union debate, he actually was on the side of the billionaires, agreeing that it's okay to have billionaires as long as they do some kind of good. And I thought that was so ignorant because, like, he can't even compute that, billionaires come to hold so much wealth and privilege because of obviously the great exploitative nature of their businesses, of the system. So, it's very interesting, like what you say, like they're willing to tolerate certain means to certain ends. And sometimes those ends don't even meet what I think Peter Singer would like to see, a much more humane world that would be free of animal suffering. So yeah, so just a few observations in mind. So I just want to say a few things, right? To kind of just follow up from this. So, your criticism of the movement, right? They kind of come in two layers. So there's the intellectual argument, which you kind of expounded on, right? And that's the main content we're talking about. But there's also the other personal layer, which you also write about, and that deals with the social and political associations of some of the leaders of this group. So such as whether they support Nazi or right-wing authoritarian views or ideologies, or the case of Nick Bostrom, who has been exposed to using racist slurs in his emails. So in philosophy, right, it's sometimes argued that one should separate the merits of the argument or of the ideas from the thinker, and that's the way some philosophers have tried to grapple with Immanuel Kant or David Hume, brilliant philosophical giants, but both men obviously have the racist views of their time. So do you think this also applies in this case? If you could find a living saint within the TESCREAL movement, right? And there may be at least one or two, I presume, right? But is there a way to kind of like analyze these ideas and still understand that that either there's no demarcation from the person and the ideas, or even if you could do that, it doesn't really matter because the ideas in itself are quite rewarding or flawed or wrong to begin with. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would say that the ideas of long-termism, transhumanism, and so on are deeply problematic, independent of their provenance, independent of who is responsible for articulating these views. That said, I mean, my view on issues, questions relating to how authorial sources might contaminate ideas is that, I mean, it ties back a bit to what we were saying before, that one's experience does influence one's, at least it can in many cases influence the philosophical view that one comes to. So why not be transparent about that? But yeah, I think that there are other cases where when people are asked about their past behaviors, they are willing to apologize. And I sort of take seriously this idea that people can, and in certain circumstances should, be forgiven for bad behavior. I mean, in one of my articles for Truthdig on the connection between eugenics and long-termism, I mentioned that for me a good apology is there's three steps. One is to make a compelling and sincere case that you understand why what you did was wrong. Make it a compelling and sincere case for why you are remorseful, why you really regret having caused those harms, and then make it clear that you will do something to rectify the situation moving forward. And I feel like, I mean, if somebody goes through those steps, then it seems like their apology is sincere and meaningful. And then I'm willing to, I mean, there are, like, for example, white nationalists who left white nationalism and now are like, I think, just decent people who are out there making a living, trying to convert people who are still trapped in this hateful community and still under the spell of this hateful ideology to a more tolerant, worldview. And so that's that's wonderful. And so with respect to Bostrom, there was no sense of sincere remorse for or understanding really for why what he said in that email, which became public because I came across it late last year. Yes, and so I mean, actually, it was sort of the opposite. I mean, he released this apology, which many described as a non-apology because it didn't really address what was problematic about the things he had said in his email. He said, quote, "Blacks are more stupid than whites," and then he used the N-word. And to the contrary, I mean, he updated his website in response to the backlash by basically referring to social justice advocates as bloodthirsty mosquitoes that are buzzing around his head, distracting him from more important things. So if anything, his apology just sort of, and his response to these emails becoming public just made things much worse. And so, yeah, I do think that it contaminates his views. But to be honest, when I initially came across that email, my plan was to mention it at the very end of an article, just in passing. The main focus of the article was everything he's written since that email, which dates back to 1996. Because it's everything he's written since that I think is even more problematic, or just as problematic. And then his apology just sort of became the story, because it was such an appallingly bad apology. So yeah, I don't know. Good question. It is a really complicated issue, like particularly with historical figures, like Kant and Hume and Henry Sidgwick, and there were a bunch of people who held just atrocious, racist, homophobic, and so on views, but their philosophy is pretty good. So yeah, I don't really know exactly how to navigate that, but maybe in particular with respect to contemporary figures who have an opportunity to apologize but don't, then I think there's a better case to make that this person holds awful views and that casts a shadow on their work.
In this TESCREAL movement, right? Like, one of the things you mentioned is how they want to perfect the human being, right? And so there's a fascination to upgrade and to create a superior race of posthumans, who will be immortal, super intelligent, perfect control over their emotions. And just to give the viewers a real example of something that's happening right now, and there's a reason why I'm bringing him up. So there's a billionaire called Brian Johnson who is highly motivated to reverse the aging process and has resorted to drawing blood plasma from his 17-year-old son and gives his own blood to his elderly dad as part of a tri-generational blood exchange. And in addition, I just found out he's conducting shockwave therapy on his penis to gain teenage-like erections. And his goal is to have an erection for 3 hours and 30 minutes a night. Okay, so anyways, it's just to really illustrate, how serious these people are, right? And just not to mention his regimental regime about being healthy and fit. And I get that, but what he's doing right now is really quite up there. So in any case, my question to you is that, and this relates back to philosophy, right? So do you think one of the major issues here is, there's this existential ontological discontent for the human condition, that we are fundamentally a flawed species, to me, undeniably animalistic, right? And unable to make peace with our limitations. And so in this sense, going back to these people, do you think the solution is kind of good philosophy, the kind of philosophy that doesn't postulate human beings as dominants of nature? Do you think that's really the way we should try to address these issues? And, do you think these thinkers as well, like, why are they held in such high regard in the philosophy discipline? Do you think that speaks to something problematic about, the practice of philosophy itself?
You mean transhumanists being held in high regard?
Yeah. Yeah. Like,
yeah. So,
yeah.
I mean, one thing I would say about that is I think that a lot of transhumanists kind of aren't. They're not, Bostrom's views haven't really, they've been influential among a handful of bioethicists or people working in the field of bioethics. But bioethics itself just doesn't have like the greatest reputation. My sense is that a lot of philosophers find transhumanism to be just kind of really flaky and just not the most reputable position that one could take.
It's more about the public attitude, maybe the people out there who are more attracted, who are sort of falling under a certain spell, right?
Yeah. And so another thing I would mention is that, I'm sympathetic with these people who suffer from death anxiety. They don't, who are nervous about getting old and becoming, having difficulty getting around and, losing their mental faculties and so on. Like, I understand that. And I don't have any principled objection to re-engineering humanity. There's like the playing God argument, which I just don't find cogent at all. My main issue is mostly a practical ethical issue. How does the transhumanist project play out in the real world? What are when we talk about like enhancing, that's a normative term. Well, what are the values that determine whether something is considered better or worse? And if you look at those values, oftentimes they are deeply problematic. I mean, it is, values, for example, that are drawn from the domain of technology. So, speed, faster, greater computational processing capacity, longer, more durable, more reliable, more, all of these traits that we apply to machines. And with respect to machines, they are good. The faster it is, the more computational processing capacity it has, the better it is, and so on and so on. But with respect to humans, maybe not. Maybe the most satisfying, deeply rewarding kinds of existence that we could have are not ones where we're just moving faster and we're able to process information more, we're able to remember more, and so on. So I think there's this, we built these technologies, and then the values that we use to determine whether the technologies are good or bad, we then export into the domain of humanity, apply them there, and then those values inform how a lot of transhumanists think of what it means to enhance humanity. And so that's problematic. And then also just in terms of how this project would be realized in the real world, we talked about, society, about the Techno-Utopian vision being very homogenous and lacking a lot of the rich diversity that characterizes our world right now. There's some philosophers, like Robert Sparrow is one, who's argued that if the transhumanist project were implemented right now, the result would be very quickly an extremely homogenous society. So he says, like, imagine that you live in a society that's racist. Let's say it's a society exactly like ours, which is very racist. Where, like, if you have, in the US, for example, if you have darker skin, if you're Black, you have a much greater chance of being pulled over by the police, of being, assaulted by police, of being thrown into prison for crimes like drug possession, whereas white people who possess the same amount of drugs tend not to go to prison, and so on and so on. So if you are a rational parent in a society that's racist, where darker skin tones have much greater disadvantages than lighter skin tones, and if you are a parent who has an option of determining the skin tone of your child, it would be, one could argue, it would be irrational not to choose a child with lighter skin tone. So, because you want your child to have the best shot in life. And it's just a fact that in a racist society, certain skin tones are going to be, better off. And so basically, this is his argument that, over just one or two generations, you could have society homogenize in some like very significant way towards, just white people who have blue eyes and blonde hair and so on. And the more parents who are choosing to produce kids who have these particular characteristics, the greater the pressure there is for other parents to conform. So, if you have a society that's 50% white, 50% non-white, and white people have an advantage because of the society is racist, then you have some impetus for choosing a child who is lighter skin. But as society becomes more and more white, if you have 90% of society of children who are white and 10% who are non-white, the pressure is even greater. So he basically makes this case that, yeah, in practice, the outcome of transhumanism, which is supposed to be a liberal form of eugenics, is more or less indistinguishable from what the old authoritarian eugenicists of the 20th century hoped to achieve. Just, one dominant race, all of those attributes of sexism and racism and so on, those are going to influence what society ends up looking like. So that's another reason why I'm really opposed to transhumanism. So it's not an in-principle thing. I don't care about playing God in a different world, like radically different society where these tools were genuinely egalitarian and people took seriously things like equality and tolerance and so on, then I'm not sure I'd have a big issue if we wanted to go and modify ourselves. But in this particular world, I do have a very strong objection to it.
Yeah, just to say two things, which is, I'm based in Singapore, but there was a survey some years back I saw in a magazine where I asked the question, what race would you want your child to be like? And the overwhelming majority of the answers were white. So,
Yeah.
so that's telling. And then the other thing that is happening right now, as we speak, there are interesting cases of people trying to change their race. So sometimes it's known as trans racism. So
yeah,
I think of at least one person who tried to change from white to Korean, something like that. And other studies, there are other people like that as well. So it's very interesting to see this kind of pursuits and how, as you mentioned, right, if we live in a different world, maybe you wouldn't see such things or see this kind of jealousies or envies of another race, but we currently live in this world. And so, as you said, it would be a very different future if we had such, engineering technology. So I just want to ask you two last questions. Okay. So the second last question, because I promise you that we try to get back to this, right, which is obviously we've talked so much. So I just want to ask you a simple question. What's your main takeaway to the viewers, right, for your writings on the ethics of human extinction, right? As you mentioned many times, you are not a pro-extinctionist. There's an article that you've written to address the Guardian's mischaracterization of you. So I would advise people also to look at what you've written in response to the Guardian and not just look at the Guardian article, right? So, I'm going to quote from you in your letter to the Guardian. You write, "Those who accept my view will in practice work diligently to not only ensure humanity's continued survival by reducing the probability of global catastrophic risk, but make the future as good as it can possibly be." And so my question to you is, what should one do to work on to make the future as good as possible?
Yeah, good question. I don't really have a great answer except to mention the obvious that, climate change is an ongoing catastrophe that, there's the window for meaningful actions to prevent the worst outcomes is closing rapidly. So there is a kind of moral urgency to the situation. There was a study out just recently that concluded that at least 1 billion people in the next century will die prematurely as a result of climate change. So, it's just a staggering number, and that's sort of a lower bound estimate. There are other climatologists on social media who have said the number is probably like 4 billion, which is just so. But so I don't know. Like now is sort of crunch time with respect to climate change. But even saying that, I'm not sure what the best way to influence policy is. Go protest, but doesn't make a huge difference. So I don't really know. To be honest, I feel a bit this is one reason I feel a bit pessimistic about the future, despite my natural disposition towards optimism and yeah, and a sort of a cheerful, roseate sort of outlook. I don't really know what to do. I mean, one of the thing I think in the Bright Side of Extinction essay, I mentioned that we're just sort of passive spectators, and that's that feeling of helplessness is deeply frustrating. But I'm not sure. This is a topic that I would like to focus on in future work. Because I have a lot of complaining in a lot of the a lot of philosophizing with the hammer, a lot of listing objections, but I don't have many solutions, and I think that should change. So,
And I think that's okay because we don't
yeah,
always have answers. Yeah.
yeah,
And it's great that you answered that honestly. Yeah, because I think everyone's going to find their own way to manage their anxiety and their disquietism around with the world. And
yeah,
and philosophy is one revenue of looking for solace, comfort, knowledge, and some sense of knowing what to do with that.
mhm,
That fact. So my last question, just for fun, okay? I left out in your bio, okay, when I introduced you, this most unique aspect of yourself, which is you were once a musician and audio engineer. You've written songs, released multiple albums before. So my last question to you is, have you written any songs, or could you nominate a song that's going to be about human extinction or the TESCREAL movement? If you haven't, why haven't you? Or can you think of a song in mind that really best describes your attitude to human extinction, or separately maybe the TESCREAL movement? Yeah.
yeah. I love this question because a lot of the songs that I wrote under the name Baobab was the band, a little solo project of mine. They were sort of about death, and just the sadness of death, and yeah, I don't know, coming to terms with one's mortality. So, that connects in a certain way to human extinction, the death of everyone. But I don't know. I'm avoiding the this isn't a direct answer to the question, but one of the songs I like the most is the one that concludes the audio recording of me on YouTube reading the summary of the entire book, Human Extinction. And so that was one that I had recorded back in, it must have been like 2012 or maybe 2011. And I don't know, I feel like it's the aim with that song was to capture one aspect of the beauty and mystery of human existence. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's one of my, not that I'm like a fan of my own work, but insofar as I like any of the songs I wrote, that's my favorite.
Right. Right. Well, like I said, maybe I leave these questions for something for you to work on as well. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, so anyway, thanks so much for spending all this time with me, Emil. I really, really appreciate it. To our viewers, I just want, perhaps you should just tell our viewers where they can look you up so they can have, access to your work and, continue to find you on the internet.
Yeah, sure. So for some reason, I'm still on Twitter, and my handle is at xriskology, as in the study of a risk, but with an X before it. So xriskology. And that's also the URL for my website. So xriskology.com.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
edit in the description. So yeah, so
great.
thank you so much. I really appreciate again, this time that we spent talking about this fascinating topic and to connect with you also on a personal level. So I really wish you all the best, and I hope that we stick again in the future because I'm really excited to see, the books that you say you're going to be working on. So I hope we can reconnect again.
I would love to reconnect. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate all the excellent questions, and it was a real, genuine pleasure to chat with you. So thank you.